Great. Yes.
So that's tomorrow?
Yes. Busy week.
Always a busy week.
Yeah, I know. Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to get started. Thank you all for coming. It is so lovely. I didn't, as you know, have people RSVP for this event, so I had no idea how many people were going to show up. Because I know that there's so much going on in the school, so I'm grateful to see so many faces today. I want to start by acknowledging that the land we're on today has been the site of human activity since time immemorial. And it's funny to say that when I can see the CN Tower in the background. Obviously the landscape has changed quite drastically. But people have been living here for a long time, including the Huron-Wendat, the Petun, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. Of course, I'm a Métis person, so I'm a guest on this land, and I'm really grateful that I get to live and work here on this territory. The relationships on this land are governed and symbolized in different wampum belts, including the dish with one spoon wampum belt and the two-row wampum belt, which you may have seen a replica of in the solarium, which is in the other law school building. And if you've never had a chance to look at that wampum, please go and check it out. And if you want to talk about it or learn more about the teachings, I'm always here in the law school to talk about those kinds of things. I also wanted to just take a really brief moment to acknowledge the victims in Las Vegas and the terrible tragedy that happened there. I didn't learn about that until this morning when I went on Twitter to tweet about this, and you know, spent quite a bit of time finding out what had happened there. And it's a huge tragedy, and I wonder how many times these things will have to happen before we recognize that guns are bad. So yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge that. But then also, you know, among the many terrible things that are the creation of human beings, wrongful convictions are another thing. And that's what we're here to acknowledge today. So today is the 4th International Wrongful Conviction Day, and it is something that was actually started right here in Toronto. It was the idea of a few people at Innocence Canada, but Win War was one of those key people in starting Wrongful Conviction Day, and it has really taken off like wildfire. I don't think that we could have estimated, and it certainly is no coincidence. It's something that a lot of people have put a lot of time and effort into making sure that people understand it, but it's a day of recognition, certainly not a day of celebration. But a day where we recognize that these terrible things, wrongful convictions, miscarriages of justice, certainly happen, and that we need to do more to prevent them. And when they do happen, to make sure that they are rectified more quickly than they are, because as Ron will talk about today, there is not enough that is happening. So Ron and I have had the pleasure of working together for 4 years through Innocence Canada, and that is a national organization in Canada, the only national organization that is not connected to a law school, that is working on both prevention of wrongful convictions and also fixing them after the fact. And they have exonerated a total of 21 people, and all of those people's names I'm wearing on my shirt today. And I'm really proud to wear these people's names on my shirt because they are incredible people who have incredible strength and resilience. Ron's name is not on my shirt because he was not a client of Innocence Canada, but he is now a co-president of the organization, which is formerly AIDWIC. And you'll notice at the bottom of this shirt there is a space. And that is because there are many, many more people who are waiting to have their name cleared and waiting for their day of justice. Is kind of a funny term. It's a loaded term because I think justice will forever elude people who've been through this terrible tragedy. But you know, to have it recognized that these things happen to them, be it get them out of prison, or they may already be out of prison but they want to have their name cleared. So I totally went off my script. I'm going to go back and see what I wanted to talk about. So for those of you who don't know, my name is Amanda. I'm the manager of Indigenous initiatives here at the law school. As I mentioned, I'm a Métis person. I'm also a graduate of this fine faculty, which was not as fancy and lovely when I went here. But I'm really grateful that I now get to work here. I graduated in 2012, and in my second year of law school, I took a wrongful convictions class with Professor Kent Roach. And even though I was a criminology student in undergrad, I had never really thought about wrongful convictions. And I have to say, and maybe I should be embarrassed that this is the truth, but I had really never thought, the criminal justice system could make mistakes. My motivation for taking criminology and my motivation for going to law school was to try to address the drastic overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the criminal justice system. So certainly I knew that Indigenous people were overrepresented, but I'd never, until I took Professor Roach's class, I had never really thought about the fact that, maybe some of those Indigenous people shouldn't be there. You know, it was a real light bulb moment for me. So I have to say that is what led me to apply to do my articles with what was then the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted, now called Innocence Canada. And when I had my interview for articling, they told me, just so you know, there's absolutely no chance you will get hired back. You will be here for 1 year and then you will be gone. I proved them wrong and I stayed for 4 years. Largely because Ron and the other board members were willing to take a chance on me and scrape together money so that I could do some legal education and outreach with the organization, focusing particularly on Indigenous communities. And it was awesome. It was an awesome 4 years. I was really grateful for the opportunity. I rejoined the Faculty of Law in September of last year, but I've really stayed in touch with my former colleagues. And as many of you know, because you're in the class, I now have the great privilege of teaching the Wrongful Convictions class with Professor Kent Roach. So it all kind of came full circle. Funny how these things work. And that's enough about me. Okay, so you're here for Ron's story. I'm not going to tell you about his case because I couldn't put it as eloquently as he will. And it's just better hearing it from the mouth of someone who's been through it. I will tell you, he is a lovely human being. He is kind, he is patient, he's generous with his time. He flies across the country at his own expense frequently to do things like speak about wrongful convictions, as I'm sure many of you have probably already thought about, but if you haven't already, you will when you're hearing Ron speak. It's not easy for people who've been through this to relive what they've been through. And I'm not going to put words in his mouth, but I'm sure you can imagine, you know, for most of us, if we had been through something like this, probably just want to bury it and never think about it again, right? Really want to move on. So number one, to be strong enough to go through this, and number two, to be strong enough to go from coast to coast to coast to talk to people, to make sure that it happens less frequently. I mean, that's outstanding. So we're really, really lucky to have him here with us today. I already mentioned he's the co-president of Innocence Canada. He was the chair of the Outreach and Education Committee on the board, so that's how we got to spend some time together. And the final thing I'll say is, as you may or may not know, Ron is not an Indigenous person, but this is something I actually think, for the purposes of International Wrongful Convictions Day, his background and where he was before he went through this wrongful conviction is almost more powerful, because we think, okay, well, maybe this happens to racialized people, maybe this happens to people who are living in poverty or people who are homeless, but certainly this couldn't happen to a white man who has a good job and a great family. It couldn't happen to someone like this, but Ron is going to tell you about how it did happen to him. And the final reason I think Ron's story is so powerful is because while lawyers were not really the cause of his wrongful conviction in the first instance, they certainly led to his tragedy lasting days, months, and years longer than it had to. And how many of you are going to be lawyers very soon? Or are already lawyers? A few hands. There are a few people. I mean, I know more of you are law students. I don't know what if you're just worried about whether or not it's going to happen. But you know, you're going to hear this story, and as Indigenous folks across Turtle Island, or what we call North America, a lot of us share in common the grandfather teachings. And those grandfather teachings are honesty, truth, love, wisdom, courage, respect, and humility. And I actually think that we should use all of these teachings to teach legal ethics on a more regular basis, and that's something I've been talking to people about within the law school. But in particular, I want you to think about humility when you listen to Ron's story. Sometimes it's hard to look stupid. Sometimes it's hard to ask a question. As I'm sure all of you know from sitting in class, there's probably been an occasion already today on Monday morning where you weren't really sure what someone was talking about, but you didn't have the guts to raise your hand and ask the question. And as lawyers, and I mean as people, we don't want to look stupid. We don't want to admit when we've made mistakes. But that humility is so important, and each one of these wrongful conviction cases is a lesson in humility, but particularly Ron's case, as you're going to hear about, is something that I hope that you will carry with you for the rest of your time as law students, as articling students, and also as lawyers in your practice, because we all make mistakes. Unfortunately, people suffer because of our mistakes. I mean, they call it a legal practice, which in and of itself is a little scary, but we don't need to drag those mistakes out longer than they happen. So with that, that's way more than I probably should have said, but please help me recognize Ron and welcome him to the class.
Thank you. Can you hear me at the back?
Yes.
Kent's good. The wife is good in the back. Amanda, you got to smile at my wife when you talk about the kind and gentle stuff. Patience especially, yes. I knew I shouldn't have brought her, but it's too late. My story goes back, this part of my life story at least goes back to the summer of 1988. Way back then I was a bank manager in a small town in Newfoundland, town of Gander. Gander was a town that had been started during the Second World War, so they'd have a base there to train pilots. Up to 1988, there had never been a homicide trial in the town of Gander. There was only 8,000 or 9,000 people there. 4 banks in town, so if you're one of the bank managers, you get to know a lot of the people, because everybody has at least 2 bank accounts. And different banks, in case you don't get along with one guy, you're going to go to the other one. My wife and I and our 3 children had been living there for a couple of years by 1988. In the middle of August that year, my wife and I were sitting home watching the evening news. CBC National News came on back at that particular year at 11:30 Newfoundland time. It was the 1 year Newfoundland experiment with double daylight savings time, which turned out not to be such a great experiment. They're already a bit out of touch with the rest of the country, so they were an extra hour out of touch in that year. But our 3 children were asleep upstairs in their rooms. We had a 9-year-old son, a 6-year-old daughter, and an 18-month-old son at the time. Now, depending on whose version of events you go with, if the Crown would suggest that at some point during the news I reached over and grabbed my wife by the throat and strangled her without waking any of the children or anything, and when I was sure enough she was dead, then I called the ambulance and had them come in and rush her off to the hospital. But what happened now is my wife was nibbling on a little bit of dry cereal. She had a small little 3 or 4 ounce glass dish in her hand, and she was nibbling on some Quaker Harvest Crunch, as it happened. Dry, chunky cereal stuff. And she gave a little cough. I didn't think it was anything too serious. I reached over to give her a pat on the back, and she just kind of waved my hand away. And I asked her, did she want a drink? And she kind of nodded her head, so I went up 3 steps to the kitchen. We were down on the rec room someplace, and I went up to the kitchen, came back with a small glass of water for her, and by the time I got back, her face was kind of beet red, and she was half sitting and half kneeling in front of the little love seat where we had been seated watching television. Before she could get a glass of water, she kind of went to the floor, and she passed out briefly. Her eyes closed, and I knelt over her, and her eyes opened. Now, the telephone in the room was 10 feet away, I suppose. So I grabbed the telephone. We didn't have 911 service at the time, so I flipped it open to the number for the local hospital, who were also the local ambulance service in the small town. Now, they were 3 or 4 minutes away from the house, and they came quite quickly. I tried as best I could to clear the obstruction in her throat. In my mind, that's something simple. If you have a tube and it's blocked and someone can't breathe, then you clear the obstruction and away you go. I've learned since then it's much more complicated than that. Sometimes a piece of dust or a little feather or something that doesn't at all block your breathing tube can cause it to constrict and block off the flow of air. But at the time I thought it was a much simpler thing. The ambulance attendants came into the house. They brought a little bottle of oxygen with them, brought a stretcher. They told me they had a pulse. They did a little bit of CPR, but they very quickly put her on the stretcher and put her aboard the ambulance. As soon as they were putting her aboard the ambulance, I went across the street where one of my neighbors lived. Asked him if he would come over and stay with the 3 children for an hour or so while I went to the hospital with my wife. I didn't know how long it was going to be, but I thought an hour or so would probably do it. So as he was coming across the street, we were leaving. I followed the ambulance down to the hospital. I was just getting to the hospital as they were wheeling her into the ER room, the trauma room, the treatment room, whatever they called it. And for the next hour and a quarter, I sat in the hallway staring at a clock much like the one in the back of the room here, and watched at first the seconds and then the minutes tick by, and until about 45 minutes in, one of the nurses was passing by and stopped, and of course I was asking how she was doing and what was going on, and she made the comment that they were trying to restart her heart, which didn't sound very positive after being there for 45 minutes. By the time the doctor came out of the ER room an hour and a quarter after we got there and said he wanted to speak to me in a little side room, of course I was fearing the worst. And of course that's the news that he gave me, is that they had not been able to revive her. This was about 1:15 a.m. on the 16th of August rather. So I spent a little bit of time there. As it happened, our family doctor, who had actually delivered our youngest child, happened to be there on an obstetrics case that evening, heard that my wife was in the emergency department, came down, sat with me for a little while, took me in to see her before we left the hospital, and drove me back to our house. He didn't want me driving. He sat with me in the house for a couple of hours. The neighbor from across the street had stayed along as well. So we're into the wee hours of the morning, and I'm trying to figure out how to tell a 6- and 9-year-old that their mother has passed away when she was alive and well when they went to bed that evening at supper time, or after supper that evening. The 18-month-old wasn't going to know what was going on, and really at this point has no recollection of his mother. During that time we're discussing things, and of course the doctor eventually has to go home. He has to work the following day. He mentioned organ donations. He didn't know my wife was an organ donor. He said in tragic circumstances like that, sometimes there's a little bit of good can come out of it. And he said that because she had died or encountered a medical issue outside of the hospital setting and wasn't under a doctor's care at the time, there would automatically be an autopsy done, which he said would preclude donation of most of her organs other than the corneas of her eyes. And if I was willing to allow that to happen, he said he would dash off to the hospital, come back with the appropriate paperwork and get that process started. There's a time frame that you have to remove tissue to make it useful. He did that and came back a few moments later. My neighbor sat up all night with me until coming on daylight. He had to go home. He had a job to go to as well. He sent his wife, who happened to be my 6-year-old daughter's grade 1 teacher, or would have been. She had taught my son in grade 1 a couple of years earlier. And she came over for an hour or so while her husband went and got himself cleaned up and ready to go to work with no sleep. About that time, it was coming on 6:30, 7-ish in the morning, I went upstairs, and our 2 boys had been sleeping in the same room. The youngest guy was still in a crib, and the oldest guy in his bed, a 3-bedroom house. So I went in and I knelt down by the oldest guy's bed and tearfully told him that his mother had passed away. And he didn't know what to make of that. He cried, I cried. While we were there, the 18-month-old woke up, so the 3 of us went next door to his sister's room, and I repeated the process. I sat down, or knelt down rather, by her bed, and we told her that, and she laughed, as a 6-year-old would, you know. We were in the habit of being joking around and teasing each other a little bit. Of course, she thought her brother and I were saying something to get her going, or something first thing in the morning. She looked around, and the youngest guy was, my neighbor was there at that point, and she was standing in the doorway with my youngest son, and she let his hand go, and he came running to us, and the three of us, the three children and myself, rather, the four of us, knelt there crying for a little bit. And then a few moments later, my 6-year-old daughter asked what was for breakfast, which is one of those little moments that kind of stuck with me over the years. You know, that lots of things stood out over the years, but that was one of the things that was a bit of a wake-up call for me, that life was going to go on, and there were things that had to be attended to. And my neighbor stayed with us for a while. We went down to the kitchen and got breakfast for the children. I got on the telephone. We were living in Newfoundland, but my wife and I were both from Prince Edward Island. We had both grown up in the same small community there, gone to high school together. After university, got married, and I started working in the bank. We were back and forth on a regular basis visiting our families. We had just spent a couple weeks that summer in Prince Edward Island. So first calls I made were to my in-laws, let them know that my wife had passed away, and called my own family. And at that point, then I had other calls. I called the people at the bank to let them know I wouldn't be in and what had happened. And within an hour or so, people were starting to arrive at the house, people from the bank. People were calling then, and I had to start thinking about going to the funeral home and making arrangements to have my wife's body shipped back to Prince Edward Island for a funeral service. All kinds of things that I didn't ever think I'd be doing at the age of 32. My wife was a year younger than that, so we hadn't made those types of plans before. During the day, a police officer showed up at the house, said they had some questions they wanted to ask about what happened the evening before, and we talked very briefly. And they told me that the autopsy was underway. This was probably mid-afternoon. The autopsy was underway. The body would be released shortly. We had to convey that information to the funeral home so they would know what flights to arrange. You can't take caskets on certain flights, smaller planes and all this sort of stuff, and make arrangements on the Prince Edward Island and for somebody to be there, and all of those things. So we're trying to coordinate all of those things, trying to spend a little bit of time with the children along the way. About mid-afternoon, my mother and my sister arrived from Prince Edward Island. They had decided on their own to come over and give me a hand with the children, and they knew everybody would be upset, and if we're going back to PEI, they'd be there with us to do that. The day kind of drug on. We got away to the park for a little while, myself and the kids and my mother and sister, just to get away from the crowds that were gathering around. But the police kept putting us off, saying they didn't have results. Things were taking a little longer than expected. You'll hear shortly, and shortly turned into a little after 11 o'clock that night, roughly 24 hours from the time that my wife had choked and we had called the ambulance. At that point, they suggested that they wanted to give me the results of the autopsy, but they'd like to do that down at the local detachment. Wouldn't be upsetting to everybody in the house and everything, so my sister drove me to the detachment. She had gone back, somebody had gone back during the day to pick up my car at the hospital from the night before, and noticed the window was still open from where I was following the ambulance the night before. But she drove me down to the detachment. We're getting there shortly before midnight. They ushered me into the detachment and ushered her out of the detachment. They said she wasn't needed. They'd call her when I was ready to come back. They wouldn't allow her in. I was whisked into a little interview room, and they said, now it's time to get things down on paper. We want to do a statement, the usual kind of couple of hours of dialogue back and forth, and then the questions started to get a little more pointed. You know, was my wife seeing somebody? Was I seeing somebody? Is there a history of domestic violence there? And of course, as those types of questions start coming forward, then I'm becoming increasingly concerned. Now, I haven't slept in a day and a half, and it's a pretty upsetting day to say the least. I know my mother, sister, and my children are back home. We have a flight to catch early the next morning, and we still don't have the results of the autopsy. The travel arrangements have yet to be finalized, and now I'm stuck in the police station for 2 or 3 hours. And at one point, the door opened, and they said, there's a lawyer on the phone. I told him you'll call him back. My sister had made a number of attempts to get into the detachment and to see me and to speak to me, and was turned away on all those occasions through the night, of course, where we learn later when so many of these interrogations take place, when there's very little access to legal counsel. But she did get the names. She called someone I used to work with, found out the names of a couple local lawyers, found one that dealt with the branch, lived nearby, called him through the night, and he made a call and was told that, you know, I was only there to fill in a few details, and there's absolutely no question about being a suspect. There's no foul play or anything involved here. So he called my sister back, relayed that information. She was both relieved and a little embarrassed at having gone the distance. She thought I'd be upset that she had bothered a lawyer in the middle of the night to find out that there was nothing going on. But as the hours progressed, probably 2:30ish in the morning, once I'd been there a couple of hours and I wasn't getting answers to the questions, you know, has the autopsy been completed, when will the body be released, and everything else. And the question is getting a little more pointed. They're starting to tell me silly things, you know, I say maybe I should contact a lawyer. And of course they told me that I wouldn't need a lawyer because guilty people, a lawyer can't help them, and innocent people don't need lawyers. Now, I didn't have a lot of legal background, but it seemed to me there was a lot of people practicing law, if that was the case, that no lawyers were ever needed. So when they're starting to say silly things like that, then I'm becoming a lot less communicative. So after about 2:30 in the evening, I said, or in the morning rather, I said nothing basically. I sat there for the next 3.5 or 4 hours until they placed me under arrest, at which point my sister and the lawyer showed up and I got to speak to them. But what had happened is when my wife passed away, there is no pathologist in the small town, so they sent to St. John's, the capital city, and got the person who was acting as the forensic pathologist for the province. Happened to be somebody with a medical background in the child hospital, in the children's hospital. He operated the lab there. He did pathology work, but pathology work on tissues, and no forensic training. In Canada at that time, you couldn't get a specialty in forensic pathology. You had to leave the country to get that. There were no Canadian trained. Now, we had forensic pathologists operating in Canada, but they had been trained elsewhere. This person had no forensic training at all, was used to dealing with tissue samples in the children's hospital lab, but was the person who was acting as the pathologist for the province. Now, the province only has 500,000 people in it. Back in the 80s, there were years when there were no homicides in the province. Other years, there might be 1 and occasionally 2 homicides in the province. So no matter who was acting in that position, and no matter what training they had and background, they got very little experience. They didn't get to practice the craft, so they had no expertise and no experience in doing these things, and weren't great at interpreting results. So this chap was brought in from St. John's, performed an autopsy that completed about 11:15, about 15 minutes before they asked me to go down to the detachment. And the last thing he said at the autopsy is, this looks like single right-handed manual strangulation. You know, this was done with a single right hand, and you better go talk to the husband, which they immediately did, and within half a dozen hours had me arrested and charged with murder. The other thing that happened that evening at the hospital, when we arrived close to midnight, is the emergency department at this small hospital was in the charge of a student doctor from Ireland doing a 2-month locum. He was going to various rural hospitals in Newfoundland. As the local physicians took their holidays, this guy would fill in for them. Had some sympathy for him, notwithstanding all of the circumstances as they transpired, because he had never intubated or put a breathing tube into a live patient before. Apparently that's a tricky business, which is one of the reasons you go to law school, or to medical school rather, for a few years. And you need some practice at that. They practice on cadavers, they have models. This gentleman had never done this on a live patient. At midnight, the student doctor was presented with a young woman who was having some breathing difficulty in great distress, and had the option of calling in the anesthesiologist for the hospital, who would be the person who would intubate people usually in the hospital setting in that area, certainly during surgery and stuff, that's the person who would intubate and monitor the person's level of consciousness. But he thought that might take a bit of time that this woman couldn't afford. And he made the decision to attempt it on his own, probably the right decision, had it worked out. As it happens when you intubate somebody, you start at the mouth and you shove a 18-inch long tube into them, and there's a bifurcation in your throat that one tube goes to your stomach and one goes to your lungs, and he got it in the wrong spot. Now when you intubate a patient, I've learned all this since, these intubation tubes that they use actually have a little balloon cuff at the bottom of them, which you use to seal it in place, which is a good idea if you have it in the right place. It doesn't pull out and it stays put and all this sort of thing. So he inserted this into the wrong spot, sealed it in place, and basically sealed her fate. Then they proceeded for the next hour and a quarter or so to pump air into her stomach. And because it was sealed by this cuff, the air wasn't able to even leave there and get back up around into her lungs. Several of the RNs who were present in the emergency room pointed out to the doctor that the woman's stomach was becoming distended. Perhaps they should check, and he stopped the CPR, got his stethoscope out, and said no, it was okay. He could hear air going, and naturally he could. It just wasn't going to the right place. But they had actually pointed out to him that this is very possibly in the wrong place, and this wasn't going to work. May or may not have been too late at that point. So the lab guy comes out, does an autopsy, and brings the emergency room student doctor down, shows him that he's got the tube in the wrong place, told him that this was obviously a serious error, and he didn't know the difference until he actually attended at the autopsy. Didn't go so far as to suggest to him that perhaps that led to or contributed to the lady's demise, but simply told the police officers that this looks like single right-handed manual strangulation. Somebody has reached out with their right hand and crushed somebody's windpipe basically, or prevented them from breathing. I was arrested. It took us, I think I spent 11 or 12 days in custody after I was arrested before I had a bail hearing. So of course I missed my wife's funeral. I didn't get to be there with my children, and times and things that you'll never get back. Not that I ever wanted to go to my wife's funeral, but in those circumstances I would have wanted to be there with my children, certainly. I was fortunate enough to get bail in the first place. As I said, this was a small town that had never had a homicide trial. There had been one homicide there, but 15 years prior to this event, someone went into a convenience store and stabbed the clerk there, and that trial was moved to another town because they thought it was too scandalous to have in the one little area. So mine would come to be the first murder trial in that town. Back in the '88, it was after the charter. The charter was still being implemented by degrees and slowly, and it was pre-Stinchcombe. You're probably all familiar with the Stinchcombe ruling, which mandated fairly extensive disclosure, which we did not receive back then. They gave you what they felt they had to give you, but that wasn't very much. A lot of times the first time you saw police notes was in the middle of a trial or something, and then they opened the page and showed you while they were on the stand if the judge allowed them, and you had a quick peek at them. So there's a lot of information that we did not receive. We waited almost a year after the autopsy to get a copy of the autopsy record itself. Clearly that was going to be a bone of contention at the trial. There was no question really if my wife had have been killed by someone, that it likely wasn't one of the 3 children sleeping in their beds upstairs. I would be the right person. The issue at trial, of course, became whether or not she had been killed, or whether this had been an accidental choking, complicated by medical misadventure at the hospital and overinterpretation by an unqualified pathologist following it all. And of course, we made some mistakes as a client and lawyer in the trial that went on about 15 months afterwards. I went to trial. The first trial lasted about 6 weeks. I had hired a private counsel at St. John's who attended Gander about 4 hours away for the trial. And the Crown was represented. They called, the main evidence was the pathologist, of course, coming in saying this is a homicide. We went and found someone who was board certified at a Philadelphia, in the US, of course, board certified, who had done close to 20,000 autopsies and specialized in forensic autopsies. Came in and said, no, clearly this is not a homicide. You would have had crushed bones within your neck and all kinds of things that weren't there. And you would never, even if it had been a homicide, he said, you would never overinterpret. No one can really say, if I decide to strangle you or you decide to strangle the person next to you, exactly the mechanism. Do you use one hand, two hands, do you use your arm? If somebody goes to the extreme detail of saying this was done with a single right hand, it's really one of the red flags that you look for, that somebody is overinterpreting based on some finding. The main finding, of course, to support the autopsy, the pathologist who did the autopsy, his main finding that he used to interpret that this was a homicide was a scratch on the inside of her throat, caused by an intubation tube going in the wrong place, as it happened, and a couple of little marks around her nose where they're doing CPR for an hour and a quarter with a mask and an ambu bag and all the other equipment that they use when they're vigorously resuscitating people. So we called an expert, they called the local guy. At the end of the day, the Crown was able to stand up at the end of the first trial and say, who are you going to believe? Are you going to believe the local guy who's very loquacious, gets along well, he's got the Newfoundland accent, he's a real raconteur, great fellow to tell stories, a great guy to go to a party with, most likely, not that I'm about to. He's since deceased at this point. He got in and performed quite well in front of the jury. Had no idea what he was talking about, but the jurors wouldn't know that. Or are you going to believe the hired gun from Philadelphia? There's the guy who did the autopsy, or this other guy who got hired to look at the pictures. Who are you going to believe? You give them an either or, let's go with the local guy, you know. The banker killed his wife, which is the conclusion of the first trial. I get an automatic life sentence, as you do for second-degree murder. We didn't bother with a sentencing hearing. The judge didn't have a lot of experience with major trials. Now, as it happened, he gave me the minimum sentence at the time. You know, it's a 10-year minimum on a life sentence for second-degree murder, so we didn't appeal on that basis. Within 2 weeks, though, we did appeal the conviction itself. We had to wait about 18 months or so for transcripts, which were manually prepared in the day by the clerks of the court in their spare time when they weren't sitting in court and doing other things. They worked on the tapes from a trial and manually typed out the transcripts. It took us about 1.5 years to get those. We had to immediately file a notice of appeal. And then when we got the transcripts, of course, I'm in a maximum security prison by then. There are no federal facilities in Newfoundland, so I'm in a maximum security prison in northern New Brunswick. A little bit of a change from being behind a bank manager's desk. I'm trying to deal with now, I had paid my own way into prison. Back in the late 80s, it cost me over 100 grand to defend myself unsuccessfully. So by the time I got to prison, not only am I 1,000 miles away from the jurisdiction that's handling the matter, I have no money. Prison doesn't pay all that well. My family, my sister, who has 3 children of her own, is now looking after my 3 children as well. And you know, they don't have a lot of money to throw towards legal fees to do my appeal. I apply for and I'm granted legal aid, but who wants to work for legal aid? Not a lot of talented lawyers looking to do appellate work for legal aid rates. The lawyer who had conducted my trial agreed to do it and for legal aid rates. But after 2 years, then 3 years, about 3.5 years in, I got a 2-line letter saying that he was finding it difficult to find the time to concentrate on my appeal, and perhaps it'd be a good idea if I found someone else. My sister is a little more jaded than I after her experience and says, when the money ran out, then so did my first lawyer. And there could be a bit of truth to that. It then took me another 1.5 years or so to find another lawyer back in Newfoundland when I'm up in New Brunswick in maximum security prison, surviving among other things, and that takes a bit of your time and resources. You can't go knock on many doors when you're that far away. Telephone access is pretty limited, so you're writing a few letters hoping you can find someone. I eventually did find someone. More senior, more years at the bar and senior experience. A bit of an academic. He had written several textbooks, still writes in the field. Brilliant man, not very practical. He had practiced law and he had been a federal prosecutor at one point in time. But he came to know my case better than I did. He could quote chapter and verse. He knew all the mechanisms. He literally persuaded someone in the health department to let him go up and practice strangling cadavers in the local medical school, just to get a feel for the mechanism and what goes on and stuff. So dedication, do his homework. He had all that stuff done. He promised me, unfortunately for him as it turned out, in writing for a number of years that he was working on this. His first draft was now completed. His second draft he's working on. He had another junior lawyer working with him. He gave me, I think, 5 separate dates when he would be at the penitentiary to see me. Sometimes I was notified of those dates after the fact. But he was coming, on Thursday the 5th of January or whatever the date was, never showed up. Never actually filed anything with the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal in Newfoundland in those days, the rules of court were that if you're the appellant, then you file your notice and you also prosecute your own appeal. The Crown doesn't get involved, nor does the court get involved until you had filed your appeal and you ask to have a date set and the Crown gets their response time and then you ask for dates to be set. So you're in charge of running the show. I went through 3 chief justices of the appellate court along the way because I started to correspond directly with them when I wasn't getting any place with my lawyers, and during the years when I didn't even have a lawyer. And of course was always told, go back to your lawyer and you've got senior counsel working on this and they'll work something out and get this thing moving. And my lawyer, the second chap, had actually written to the Court of Appeal assuring them that this case was, on the front burner in his office. Might not be the only thing he was doing, but he was working studiously at all this, and he was. He traveled and he worked very studiously at it. He just didn't produce any product and didn't actually get the thing moving. But he knew it. He knew the case very well. 7 years into a life sentence, I filed my own factum with the court. Now, I freely admit it was a rather half-assed factum, the prison library being what it was, and although I was prison librarian for a while, I was no lawyer. I'd never done any appellate work, or not very much. I had done a couple of sentence appeals by that point in time, but strictly as a jailhouse lawyer. But it did force the court to start dealing with this. The Crown immediately responded that this wasn't something worthy of a response. This wasn't a complete factum. It was lacking in 1,000 different ways. The court panicked a little bit because I said, set a date anyway. I asked the court to exercise their equitable jurisdiction, a term that I had picked up in prison, because when I got to the federal institution, it had only been open a couple of years. The law library did not even have the rules of court. And of course, the rules of court for every province, including Newfoundland, state that the rules of court must be in prison libraries for access by prisoners. But you don't know that until you start sniffing around. So I wrote away, got the rules of court for each of the 4 Atlantic provinces where we drew most of the population for the prison that I was in, and then started reading them a little bit, and started reading all the case reviews that come out, the CCCs, and everybody looks forward to them every year or every month when they come by in prison. Everybody's running in to see what one of their neighbors did really. They don't always tell you the truth, and sometimes it's in the law report. But I had done some work, but I did challenge the court to exercise their equitable jurisdiction to go out and hire any expert who would agree with the original Crown pathologist. He said, don't let me pick them, don't let me spoon feed them, you go hire anyone you want. You have the jurisdiction to do that, because there are times when the judges need guidance of experts, particularly on things like complicated medical matters, and they had the jurisdiction to do that. They didn't exercise it, they refused to in my case, but I challenged them to do that. But the proverbial kind of hit the fan when I started pushing after 7.5 years in. I was now eligible for day parole. I actually made it, because you can apply for day parole 3 years before your full parole date, and I had a 10-year minimum, and 7 years in I actually applied only to be turned down. I applied specifically to be turned down, basically, because at this point I'm building a record. I know there's no chance I'm getting released directly from a maximum security prison when my appeal hasn't even been heard. The parole board did assure me, though, that the bar in Newfoundland would not stand for appeals taking this long, so they thought I should go back and check and make sure. And at one point, my sister, who was probably my biggest supporter along the way, told me later, she had actually started to question whether perhaps my appeal had been heard and was unsuccessful, and I just hadn't found a way to break it to her that this 7-8 year journey was going to be a forever type of journey. So people start to wonder after a while, you know, what's taking so long? But I wrote to the Premier, I wrote to federal and provincial justice ministers, but most of my meaningful correspondence was with the Court of Appeal themselves. I say I went through 3 separate chief justices along the way. Only one clerk of the court, though, she proved to be very, very useful. After a while, she said, you know, perhaps there's something to this and we should be looking into it a little more. She instructs her bosses, the justices. But 7.5 years in, I filed an appeal factum, asked them to set a date, and the junior, or she was junior at the time, partner in the firm that had been doing my appeal, the second guy, who had taken a lot of time, drafted a few things, and made a lot of promises. She no longer had access to my file in the office. So she was getting a little suspicious. She learned, because this is a very small bar and a small jurisdiction in Newfoundland, and her office is a block away, she learned that I had filed an appeal factum, went down and looked at it, because it's a public document, was appalled that my appeal might be heard on the basis of that document that I had filed, and actually notified the court that she was no longer had access to my file, which apparently the senior guy had taken home with him. Their firm was in the middle of breaking up a bit. She tells me in large part over things like that, and in my case in particular, she gets a little fearful for her own career. She was very junior at the time. She started working on this, but 4 or 5 years later, she's a little concerned that her name shows up in the paperwork someplace. She calls me at the prison and says, there's a lawyer in our building who does a lot of appellate work. I knew the gentleman by reputation. I had, being in the law library and talking to other prisoners in there, I knew of some of the work that he had done. He had done a large appeal for a dangerous offender that was there at the time. A bit of a maverick. He was a little on the outside. You know, he was a flashy lawyer and got himself thrown into jail on scatter time when he wouldn't sit down and shut up fast enough. Coming from my banker background, you know, where everything kind of went well and nice and steady. At the end of my first trial, for example, as the jury was out into the 3rd day, the judge is sitting there complimenting my counsel and the Crown about how amicable everything was and how well everybody got along and everything. This was not quite pleasant, you know, for some of us, but if you have to have a murder trial, this is a nice one, you know. Unfortunately, they didn't get it right, but you can't let anything like that stand in the way. This other guy was a bit more of a maverick, but she said he does good work, and she said, if you're interested, since your file is going nowhere with us, I'll have him give you a call. And of course, I was interested by that point. I'm into 7.5 years by then, and Jerome Kennedy is his name. Jerome is now one of the people on our Innocence Canada board, and as co-president, I tell him he works for me now, but that doesn't always fly with Jerome. But he picked up the phone, called me a day or two later, told me that he was willing to look into the case. He, like most of the bar in St. John's, Newfoundland, had heard of the case. It was one of these cases that never set all that well with people, but unless you're hired to do something about it, you know, it's somebody else's issue. You know that there's a bit of a smell around that case, but it's not your case, so you don't jump in. But the first thing that he did is he had me transferred back from the maximum security prison to the local lockup in St. John's, Her Majesty's Penitentiary as it was called, because it predates Confederation in Newfoundland. Not a pleasant facility, very old, but it gave me the advantage of being able to meet with him regularly and be a lot more involved in both the appeal that was ongoing, and he wanted to do a bail application at that time. And I told him after 7.5 years in, I was a lot less interested in bail than I was in perfecting my appeal. I get the one shot at the appeal. Bail could have me out with my children and family for 6 months and then back into prison or something, which is both cruel to me and to them. So I said, forget about the appeal, or about the bail at this point. Let's concentrate on the appeal. And Jerome fought and scrounged. One of the complications that I had is the lawyer who was not doing the work for, at this point, 4.5 years, had a legal aid certificate, which wasn't going to pay him well, but they wouldn't transfer that to Jerome, who was willing to do the work. They said, you can have one of our in-house lawyers, but you can't have Jerome Kennedy. So I said, well, I'm sorry, at this point, I want the guy who's going to roll up his sleeves. He had about 6 months work into this. And the first lawyer, the chap with the legal aid certificate, agreed to pay Jerome under his certificate for some of the work that he did, but I think in some ways he thought that would be a bit of an appeasement for him down the road, because he probably recognized that after 4.5 years of not doing anything, this could come back to bite him at some point. At one point, I showed up in the appeal court for a hearing, an early preliminary hearing, set some dates and talk about this, and my lawyer did not. So I had to address the court myself, and then they said, well, who do you want to represent you? I said, well, clearly I want Mr. Kennedy, who's here, to represent me. He's the guy who's doing the work, he has the expertise, and he's the guy I have the relationship with and the confidence in. Unfortunately, your legal aid commission won't allow him to be paid, and I feel shitty enough giving him $60 an hour, but he should at least get the $60 an hour. And the Chief Justice called a little break and said, well, perhaps if I make a call. And by that afternoon, the legal aid certificate at least was transferred to Jerome. But what he proceeded to do then is, he was like a dog with a bone, he wouldn't let go of it. He started lining up experts, and he started traveling around the world. He went to the Sir Bernard Knights and people who had literally written the forensic textbooks in Wales and Scotland and a number of countries across Canada and a couple in the US. Got half a dozen affidavits all saying that the first guy didn't know his arse from his elbow, as we say in Newfoundland. And we filed those with the Court of Appeal as well. At one point, Jerome said the judge made enough errors during the trial that we have enough grounds for the appeal. We don't even need all this fresh evidence, says he. Now, 7.5 years in, says I, let's do overkill. I'll take the extra 6 months. You travel around the world if we can fight the funding out of them, and we'll get all of this information. Throw it at the Court of Appeal, and eventually took them 6 months, but they ruled, of course, unanimously to overturn my conviction. Didn't take it the distance, which they, of course, rarely do, of entering an acquittal. They sent it back for trial if the Crown were so inclined. In preparation for the upcoming trial then, we went out and got some more experts, including an emergency room doctor, two of those actually, to talk about the medical misadventure, and we covered off everything we could. And we took the unusual step about 3 months before the retrial of giving all of our expert opinion evidence to the Crown, which is not something the defense normally does. You know, you show us what you got, and then you'll see what our defense is. We gave it all to them and said, do you really want to do this? You know, we've got 9 guys at this point now saying your guy doesn't know what he's talking about. We've got a couple more guys on the emergency end of things saying the same sort of thing. And they took a couple of weeks to think about it, but they came back and said, no, we're set for trial now, let's go ahead. The second trial took 9 months. The first one had taken 6 weeks. We did a bit of overkill. You know, we took 3 months in voir dire alone, just vetting all of these experts and what was going to be allowed, and going through the statement I had given, whether that would be admissible, and all the fun stuff. And then we impaneled a jury and kept them for 6 months. Eventually, of course, they entered an acquittal. The Crown took their 29 of their 30 days to decide that they were not going to try to appeal that. So a little over 12 years, or just under 12 years, the ordeal legally ended for me. I was no longer under a court order, because even when I did get released when my appeal came through, 10 years after my wife had died. I was released on bail, but it still took another 2 years then for the retrial, so it's still living under conditions. To put it in a nutshell, my daughter was 6 years old the year her mother died, She had just graduated kindergarten. The retrial ended on the 20th of June in the year 2000. And I was in Newfoundland, of course. The jury came back on a Saturday afternoon, entered an acquittal. We went to my friend's, as she was then, my friend's house for a little gathering that evening. And I got on the road then and drove to PEI for a day and a half and arrived at my daughter's high school graduation by 2.5 hours. And that was the first time in 12 years that she could look out in the audience and see one of her parents there. Her mother was no longer there, of course, and for all intents and purposes, neither was I. She had lots of people there, but it was still the first time she could look out and actually see a parent there. So things get a little better after all that. My youngest son, who was 18 months old at the time his mother passed away, came to live with myself, my girlfriend as she was at the time, became my wife. I did his junior high and high school in Newfoundland, went to university there, went back to PEI and worked for a couple of years, came back to Newfoundland and did his teaching degree, and now he's teaching high school out in northern Saskatchewan. My two oldest children are alive and well on PEI, and there's 5 grandchildren there, and my wife has a daughter in Edmonton with a couple of grandchildren out there, so life has gotten considerably better. But as if I didn't have enough time in the courtroom, as soon as my acquittal came through, not having sense enough to walk away and have a life, I immediately started civil proceedings then against the Crown, the government of Newfoundland, who employed the pathologist, but also against the lawyer who failed to represent me on appeal. It was my trial lawyer, but he sat on my case for 3.5 years, so I threw him into the mix. And then the lawyer who took over from there for another 4.5 years. Along the way, as those things were proceeding, there was a public inquiry announced, and we had the Chief Justice, the former Chief Justice, Antonio Lemaire, the late former Justice. He was the commissioner for the inquiry. There had been my case and 2 others in Newfoundland that had turned out to be wrongful convictions within about a 5-year time frame. So I'm not sure that any one of us on our own would have gotten a public inquiry and got the intention of looking and doing a post-mortem on what went wrong in these cases. But the fact that there was 3 in such a tight time frame, the fact that I, for one, wouldn't shut up and go away, led to a public inquiry. Now that took a couple of years and delayed the civil proceedings and stuff a bit, but there was a public inquiry done and some recommendations made for what they're worth. Now some of those things changed. Among the things that changed is the Court of Appeal has much different rules now. They actually set time frames. If you file a notice of appeal and you haven't done anything with it in 90 or 120 days, and they'll contact you and say, where's your factum? They'll follow the thing and monitor through the system. They cleaned up a whole big backlog that they had of cases that were either going nowhere or needed to be dealt with, and they pushed them through a little bit. So there's very, very little backlog there now. Apart from that, I don't know what I've missed along the way. That's the thumbnail sketch of how I got where I'm at. And the rest is just a bit of fun now. I have a life after all of that, and I've remarried, and my children are doing well. We have grandchildren. I'm involved in a few businesses. I still don't have sense enough to get away from the wrongful conviction things, because when I stopped and looked around after my trial was over, I looked around at who was doing this type of work, and really the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted, AIDWIC, which became Innocence Canada, were the only national group that had any measurable results. A number of people that I knew back in prison were now clients of theirs. One of them, Clayton Johnson, passed away here about 10 days ago. But Clayton and I had the dubious distinction of being the only 2 prisoners with university degrees in the prison where we were at. Both white-collar backgrounds. He was a school teacher. I've been a bank manager. Both cases where our wives died accidentally. His in Nova Scotia, mine in Newfoundland. We shared one other thing. In Clayton's case, his wife died. They didn't even do an autopsy. It was such an obvious accidental death. They buried the lady. And about 3 years later, a local RCMP fellow started digging around and started questioning things. Brought in this guy from Newfoundland who used to practice pathology. who happened to be the same gentleman, we'll call him, involved in my case, and we shared that dubious distinction as well. But out of that small prison, I think there was 120 prisoners when I got there. There's a little over 300 there now. But we've had 4 wrongful convictions, and we're working on 3 other cases. That seems like a disproportionately high percentage. We're always guessing at what the percentage is. I mean, it could be as little as 2 or 3% when you start including cases other than homicide cases, because all we look at Innocence Canada are the homicide cases, and we struggle to deal with those. We're currently dealing with 70 or 80 cases. We have 6 cases now in front of the Criminal Case Review Committee in Ottawa, which is a branch of the Federal Justice Department. Once you've exhausted all of your appeals, there's no place else to go. You come to Innocence Canada. We'll work on your case for 4 or 5 or 6 years sometimes, and we think we can demonstrate with some fresh evidence that there has been a miscarriage of justice. Then we'll ask the federal minister to refer the case back to the courts. And generally, by the time we get to that point, if we get past the federal government's department, sometimes they sit on cases for 4 or 5 years. About 15, 20, or 25 years in, sometimes those cases get referred back to the courts, who most often no longer want to proceed based on all the evidence that we've put in front of them. So we're proud as an organization to say that we've got 21 exonerations under our belt in 24 years. Next year will be the 25th year since we started. But we know there's a lot of more work out there to do. So when I looked at around us for a place to give back a little bit, I thought that was a pretty good crowd to help out if I could. Now, I don't think I'd have the stomach for doing it on a full-time basis. I have other interests. I've got years to make up for in the real world and with my family. But I still try and volunteer sometime to raise funds, speak to people, organize things, herd the cats together, whatever needs to be done in the organization. Enough about me. But we do have time for some questions and answers, hopefully.
Yes,
questions at least.
You can just repeat the questions. Not everyone projects as well as I do. So, please, yeah.
You said after you were released from jail, you sought civil remedy for, you know.
I did.
I'm curious, did your children also seek civil remedy?
I named them in the actions that we took. They didn't seek separately. I didn't really want to drag them into the courts any more than I had to, but they were there as they were included in the lawsuit. So
was it successful, or
they were.
are you
It's difficult to measure success.
are you bound by the ubiquitous?
In the majority of it, I am. The settlements with the 2 lawyers, I am. I can tell you though that the lawyers carry $1 million each worth of professional liability insurance, and they kind of tap those out. But there was a separate settlement then with the provincial government on behalf of the pathologist and the police departments.
Were your children lumped in with you, or did they say, well?
No, it was all lumped. It was one general settlement, and it was up to me to give them an allowance. Not only my children, but I included my sister and her husband, who had raised them for 10 years when I wasn't around, that sort of thing.
Do you feel as if you've been in a different province this wouldn't have happened because you would have more resources?
The question is, had I been in a different province, would this have been any different? There's no question that the Atlantic Canadian and Newfoundland in particular justice system was a little backwater at the time, and perhaps to some extent still is, but we know from the cases that we deal with in Innocence Canada that it goes right across the country. This is the center of the universe, we're told, in Canada, and we have a lot of local cases, including your Charles Smith type cases. This happens unfortunately all over the place and all over the world. One in the back first.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Ron. What advice, given that most of the people here are going to practice one day, given all of the terrible delays that you struggled, what did you find? Was it a lying when the lawyers kind of lied to you about it? What advice would you give to the people here about how they should interact with clients, particularly clients like you who were prison a couple of provinces away.
Everybody hear the question?
Yeah, Ron, can I just add to that? The other thing, so you said Jerome Kennedy, who ended up being your lawyer, is now a board member at Innocence Canada. He had heard about your case, but it wasn't his case. And if it's not your case, you don't go digging around in it. And that's something that I find is really important. And of course, you know, whether or not having a tattletale system of lawyering is something that we want to work towards. I mean, I wonder if you can speak to that in answering Ken's question as well.
Two separate issues, basically. How do you deal with your clients? Hopefully you deal with them honestly. During the public inquiry, my portion of the public inquiry, because we were looking at 3 cases, centered really on the reasons for the delays. The Crown and Province's position was the system worked perfectly. My appeal was successful. I don't know what you're complaining about. Now, it took 8.5 years for it to be successful, so Mr. Justice Lemaire, when he looked at it, thought perhaps there were some questions there about the length of time. But the lawyer who had conducted my appeal was fairly frank at the inquiry and said that he really couldn't wrap his head around, A, how he had lost the trial, because he believed I was innocent, thought he had done things well, and really couldn't deal with the loss, but also couldn't bring himself to come forward and say, I'm not the right guy to do the appeal. And sometimes we've had cases, in one case in particular, in Newfoundland, the Greg Parsons case, where one partner represented Mr. Parsons at trial and lost, and his partner took over the appeal and was very successful at it. Sometimes you need to step away and get a different perspective. If you don't know the mistakes you've made, you're going to have a hard time unraveling them. And when Jerome looked at how the first lawyer had conducted the trial, of course we saw a number of things. When I looked at it 10 years down the road, I could see a number of things. Among the big issues is the expert we brought in from Philadelphia testified before I did at the trial. So he couldn't really comment on my testimony at the first trial. He couldn't say that fits exactly with the medical findings here, and that supports this, and this supports the other thing. He testified, left town, then I testified last in the first trial. I testified for the defense first in the retrial. That made a little difference. But basically, in dealing with your clients, you have to be open and upfront. Tell them your limitations. There's no lawyer that has the expertise in trial and appellate and everything else that needs to be done. Jerome Kennedy is fond of saying that he can be an expert in anything. He's done a number of DNA cases, and they can be quite scientifically complicated. He says he can be an expert in anything for a couple of weeks. He'll forget it all when that's done, and that's fine. That may be all he's needed to be an expert for. But he can find the experts, and he knows his limitations. So know your limitations. Be upfront with your clients. There's no real substitute for that. Just towards the second part though, which was
just in terms of lawyers monitoring each other's behavior, and when there's a case in a jurisdiction, especially in a small jurisdiction where everybody kind of says,
people have questions about certain cases in a small jurisdiction in particular. You know that there's that funny case, or something smells about that Dalton case, you know, there's something not quite right about it, but not my thing. I can understand people not jumping in and saying my neighbor down the road didn't do a very good job of that. I have less sympathy for the Law Society themselves, who have the power to bring complaints against their own members. At no time did the Law Society involve themselves in the delay proceedings against either of my lawyers. They did when it came time to work out some settlement arrangements, but they didn't take any disciplinary action. They didn't say these people should be sanctioned, we should improve practice. One of the things that they did do, which rankles a little bit, is right after the 2 settlements in my case, they instituted a $50 per transaction surcharge to every legal transaction in the province. So anyone who gets a will done is charged an extra $50 to reimburse the lawyer's insurance fund. And I feel bad about that. Wasn't my doing, but that's actually the only action that they actually took. When the Lemaire inquiry was completed and he published his findings, the following day I did receive a written letter of apology from Chief Justice Clyde Wells, who was then the Chief Justice of the Appeal Court. And otherwise, you know, government-wise, there was a little press conference, you know, that's saying terrible things happen and here's a check. But the only real heartfelt thing was Clyde Wells took it on the chin and said that Mr. Justice Lemaire rightly criticized the court for not acting on my earlier letters, and they were part of the problem, and he acknowledged that. He hadn't been one of the Chief Justices that I had been dealing with. Excuse me, there were 3 before that. Now there's a question down here someplace.
Were you offered a plea at any point in your process?
Question is, was I offered a plea? Yes, I had the opportunity to plead guilty, but other than that, no, there was no negotiations as to, you know, take a manslaughter charge or anything like that. Either directly or indirectly. The Crown never approached my lawyers, and it just wasn't a question. It was an all or nothing. Either this person was killed by someone or it was accidental, and there wasn't much middle ground. It wasn't a case where you and I got into a fight, and when you hit me, I fell and hit my head on that chair. That may constitute manslaughter. You didn't intend to kill me, and this sort of thing. That didn't really enter into mine. It was more of an all or nothing situation.
Two brief questions. Are there any sort of federal politicians or provincial politicians who have subsequently kind of championed these kind of causes? Because obviously your cause isn't a federal only cause if you shoot yourself. And then secondly, has your group or groups like yours made any attempts, or is it realistic to expect that you can sort of form coalitions with victims of crime groups in terms of sort of solidarity? Because it does seem like they're sort of, you know, getting point and end point of the same type of injustice.
First question was, have any provincial or federal politicians stepped up to the plate to deal with some of these issues? I can tell you that Jerome Kennedy went on to be Justice Minister in Newfoundland for a while, so he certainly had an interest in there. Generally speaking, because of the number of cases that have happened, it's gotten a little bit easier to convince people that this does happen. At one time, nobody ever considered the possibility that the courts got things wrong. Back in the first case that I recall, other than my mother telling me about Stephen Truscott back in '59, because she happened to be living up here and, at the time and was familiar with the case, and that was a blight on Canadian society for 49 years. And that was one of the Innocence Canada cases that we were quite proud of being able to clear his name. But some of the politicians, like the rest of us, they're not much different than the rest of us, because the rest of us hadn't given a lot of thought to wrongful convictions until things like Donald Marshall was one of the first cases that came about. And Donald, of course, was an Indigenous person from Nova Scotia. He was one of the first cases that came to light as a case of wrongful conviction. I've met with Donald a couple of times. He passed away a few years ago as well now, unfortunately. But one of the gatherings, we had 8 or 10 wrongly convicted individuals there, and this great big hairy-ass biker came over and to meet Donald and started crying, you know, that one of the things that kept this guy going when he was in prison for 20 years was knowing that Donald at least had been able to prove that he was innocent and that it was possible. And the more and more cases that come forward, the more recognition there is that this does happen. We haven't had a lot of coalitions with victims' rights organizations. They're flip sides of the same coin, I suppose, but they come at it from a much different perspective. A lot of times the victims are understandably quite angry. Sometimes we found ourselves on the side of the victims. Yeah, I think of cases like David Milgaard's, where we not only proved that David Milgaard did not kill Gail Miller, we proved who did kill Gail Miller. And we led to Larry Fisher's conviction in that case. There's been other cases, the Greg Parsons case in Newfoundland, it was similar. But we didn't do that through involvement with any victims' rights organizations, which for some of these cases going back as far as the Milgaard and Truscott didn't even exist in those days. They're more recent phenomena. We have collaborated with law schools and Professor Roach and others across the country, and used brilliant minds like your own to look at cases and do some of the late work. One of the issues with that is these cases literally take years and years and years. So you might roll up your sleeves as a first-year law student and say, this is very interesting. Let's delve into this case. And Amanda, you've done some of that work. You're down at the University of New Brunswick, working on a case that we're still working on. You might do some work on the case, but you're not there for the follow-through, and you don't see it through no fault of your own, of course. We lose people along the way. We don't always get reviewers and lawyers who are able to stick around, because a lot of the work we do is nonprofit. We're not federally funded. We're, as a nonprofit organization, spend half of our time trying to raise the money to exist, and the other half of our time then doing the work that we want to do, as well as doing important work like we used Amanda for, doing the outreach and education, getting the word out there, trying to prevent as much as you can wrongful convictions. Now, we understand that as long as this is the criminal justice system is operated by human beings, there's always going to be mistakes. But at least we can encourage that mistakes should be brought forward and dealt with. They don't all have to take 8 or 10 or 15 or 20, or in Stephen Truscott's case, 49 years to correct. But when you take that long, it's virtually impossible to find the perpetrator in the Truscott case, for example.
I'm wondering if after everything that's happened, you feel like you got justice, or what does justice look like in these cases?
Did I get justice? Hell no. I don't think there's any way to, you just can't get back those missing years. That 6-year-old little girl doesn't get back those dozen missing years when her father wasn't around. And, my wife died perhaps unnecessarily, perhaps accidentally, tragically, but she may have even been able to be saved at that point. And there's an injustice in that. There's an injustice in what I went through, what my family went through, and everybody went through. You don't get those years back. So no, there's no real sense of justice. You can plug away at it in ways like I do sometimes when I have the opportunity to hope that you can make things a little bit better for the people coming through. You can alert people like yourselves to use your own brain, apply the scientific method, rule everything else out, and what you're left with will be closer to the truth and justice. Had the Crown in Newfoundland back in 1988 taken a step back, I wasn't going anyplace, I wasn't exactly a danger to the public. They could have just taken that pathologist's report, gone to somebody who was forensically trained and qualified, spend a few bucks and hand it out to a couple people and say, does this look right? Let's stop and make sure we got our ducks in a row here. And at the retrial, a dozen years after the first trial, or 10 years after the first trial, we had a completely different trial. Of course, it took 9 months, but we had boxes and boxes of disclosure that we had not been entitled to and that they never expected us to see, because the rules of court had evolved over time. And we saw some of the discussion that went on among the police officers, the local detachment and the regional detachment arguing over whether you should arrest him now, you should wait, should we check this out, all these sort of things that could have and should have been done. Now they're a little cuter, they don't make as many notes because they know you're going to see them, so there's still issues to deal with there.
So
Young lady in the front row.
You mentioned your case happened before the Stinchcombe decision and largely before the charter had been fully realized, if we can say it has been now. Do you think that wrongful convictions then are a thing of the past, or do you think that's something that we should still be concerned about?
Is that a trick question? I can only wish that they were a thing of the past, but I know that that's never going to be the case, because invariably humans make mistakes. And we're very reluctant. I'm a fan of championing mistakes. Now, I don't like to say that to my children and grandchildren too often, but really we can learn so much from the mistakes that we made. We've done a number of, there's 7 or 8 public inquiries in this country that have looked into cases like my own and the Truscott and Milgard, and there's lessons to be learned from those things. And we can take those lessons and move forward to improve our practices and the way we do business to hopefully reduce them. But obviously this is a problem that's not going away. We can pat ourselves on the back and say we don't have the death penalty in this country, because I and several others would not be around if we did have, although we stopped using it. Even when we had it, we didn't use it that much in the latter years. But we look at countries not far away that are much worse shape. You know, I've attended a number of conferences with innocence networks in the U.S. where we have a lot of poor black people coming off of death row, and a lot more left behind. You know, the situation is difficult in Canada, but it's worse in other places.
How has your experience helped you understand intersectionality and wrongful convictions? Speaking to other people who have been convicted, who are people of color, has that, you know, what insight has that given you?
Well, it makes you realize pretty quickly that we're all alike, because a month or so after you get into the prison, you're no longer the local white bank manager, you're just another one of the prisoners. You know, I'm 598-616A forever sort of thing, and that's it. But I've found it in dealing with other countries in particular where race is even a bigger issue than it is here, that you have a lot more in common than separates us. Which, of course, underneath we all know, but we don't always play out. And race has played a big issue in a number of the cases, even in Canada. We like to think that we're not a racist nation, but it's still a big issue. We're disproportionate number of Aboriginal and Indigenous people represented in the prison systems, for sure. So understandably, a number of them are wrongfully convicted as well. And bear in mind that the work that Innocence Canada does is only looking at those worst cases. There's all the other cases out there where there's a lot of other injustices there.
Great. Okay.
Enough.
Enough. Let's. Thank you card for Ron. Don't wait for the money to fall out. It's not going to. But what we've decided, what Kent and I have decided in our class is, in lieu of giving little tchotchkes to our speakers this year, at the end of the semester, we're going to make a donation to Innocence Canada, because we also have Maria Shepherd, who is on my t-shirt. Also, the 21st exoneree of Innocence Canada came in, and you've heard us mention Innocence Canada a few times, and it's a national organization, and it's a charity, and it's the 25th anniversary.
Next year.
There are 5 staff, and not all of them are working full-time.
A lot of volunteers, though. A lot of the people who do the grunt work and carry these cases for years are volunteer case reviewers, some of them students, some of them lawyers. If you find yourself down the road in a firm that does some pro bono work, we'll use you.
Yeah.
We don't mind at all.
So I think that's a really important thing to underscore. This is something, there are still not enough resources put into Innocence Canada. So we're just so grateful. The other thing I wanted to do is thank the Criminal Law Students Association for their support in organizing this event and for getting the word out, because it was kind of last minute that we were able to organize this. And also Professor Roach's research funds are paying for your pizza lunch.
Hey.
So thank you to Professor.
I knew they didn't all come to see me.
They did. They did. So there's also an event tonight, because it is International Wrongful Conviction Day. So this evening at the Law Society, there's a reception from 5:30 until 7:30 in Convocation Hall. And Marie Hennon is going to be speaking. She's the keynote tonight. A number of the wrongly convicted will be there as well. So I'd encourage you to attend that. And the final thing, and the students will laugh at me because I always do this, but if any of the Criminal Law Student Association members want to come and take a photo with Ron, then hopefully Ron's okay with that.
Hard to say no now, isn't it?
Awkward. Okay, so please help me thank Ron one more time.